having taken his time to catch his breath and figure out where exactly he was and what kind of threats he was actually going to be facing, Victor was ready to move on. He saw something in the shadows and looked like another damn spider. And, predictably, it was. Although, surprisingly, it appeared to struggle a bit with the shadows as well. It didn't attack him immediately. Perhaps it relied on those webs that he stepped on to actually see anything. The more he battled these, the more he wished he'd trained his martial prowess just a bit more. He could use spells normally to speed up the process, but he frankly didn't have much of an arsenal here that would deal enough damage to truly knock out these spiders. And usually he'd rely on things like fireball or magic missile or something else. It did seem that destroying the spiders, just like with the bears, cleared up the areas visually a bit. A bit of garbage on the ground. Might be something of worth. No, just remains. Lovely, and remnants of shadow. Another grouping of darkness and webbing. This is one that he already cleared out, though. Though he didn't recall checking the rubble. It seemed like there was anything of note inside, though. A cliff face of some sort. Unfortunately, it was too steep for him to try to jump across. He had to go the old-fashioned way, it would seem. Victor does not like this darkness that is so deep he can't see through it even slightly. A couple feet. That's all he can visualize. Well, and he's found the source. Another of these damn spiders that he almost tripped on. The fact that they seemed hindered as well made him think that these creatures were not actually from this plane. Perhaps they were like the shades, forcibly drug in during the quakes of the surrounding dimension. It would explain quite a bit on why they themselves seem to be hampered by their own darkness, only partially through their metamorphosis. It was difficult to say. At least their fangs couldn't pierce him as long as he kept his guard up. The enchantments kept him quite safe. Then with that spider dead, he now had much better visual ability. Clearly. And he heard a voice in the distance. A tree of some sort. Oh, by the gods! As he approached the woman that appeared to be trapped, a shadow treant of some sort had grabbed him and pulled him into the loose soil. He nearly suffocated as the dirt and rubble enclosed around him, strangling him. He needed a moment just to get his bearings again. It appeared he was in some underground cavern. Great roots surrounding him, holding it up instead of rock pillars. Hacking up what little dirt was still remaining in his esophagus, Victor did his best to get a grip on his surroundings. There didn't appear to be any initial threats, though the fact that the treant had just drug him down here and not killed him made it, well, relatively clear that it expected something else to take care of him down here. A curious plant decorated the wall that looked like ivy made of shadows. Reaching out to touch them, it was as though his hand just phased through them, making his hand feel almost numb, as if he'd been sleeping on it for too long. Uncertain of exactly what to make of such a thing, apologies, had a slight issue outside of the game. Back to it. After exploring the ivy and examining the roots, he would try to understand exactly what he was dealing with. The roots appeared to have pushed upward, which meant that it would be further down, but down below, as far as anything else that he located. The treant was likely beneath this cavern, and he really didn't like that toxic gas that was clearly permeating from that door. So, he will try to find another route, and if he can't find one, he'll take what he can get. Luckily, it seems there's... Oh, well then. Root gnawers are large rodent mutations. They usually live on roots of large trees, gnawing their way through the roots to nests. Well, they certainly weren't that threatening. Just overgrown humanoid rats. He thought they'd been were-rats initially. But blood was dripping from the ceiling. Perhaps that poor soul above had finally been killed. Was the treant using bodies as fertilizer? He can't imagine that this place of shadow would be a natural home. Not for a creature like this. Had it been drugged here? And then he recalled it. There had been a book in the Shadow Lich's library, the Lich's journal, that had described the fact that he had brought in a dryad into the shadow realm as an experimentation. The poor creature was one with nature. It was... Well... It seemed the doors were trapped, and that the beetles were forcing their way through. Did that mean this other one was open in that case? They certainly wouldn't stop the beetles if they wanted to delve forward for him. It was open. Interesting. His original line of thought had been dryads were creatures of nature. They couldn't be brought into a place like this and expected to remain sane. It's just the kind of sick experimentation you'd expect from the damned lich that he put down. By some small miracle. Didn't understand how he won that battle, seeing all this, what the lich had been able to overcome. Although he supposed he was doing well enough on his own, something had nicked him. The roots were attacking him here. Perhaps if he destroyed the central root, well, it seemed effective enough. He'd have to make a mental note to do that whenever he saw them now. An errata. Well, he didn't have much choice, though he really didn't want to engage in physical confrontation with it. The flames at least would be very useful against them. Luckily, its touch hadn't managed to land on him. The errata were foul and twisted creatures that manifested from undead, usually very powerful undead, lingering in the plane for too long. The end result was, usually, that the creatures became even more potent and gained the power of a shadow fiend and undead atop that of a standard, almost like a basilisk at the touch, except instead of turning one to stone, it turned you dead, killing you outright, no matter how potent your enchantments were, unless you had the rare enchantment that made you immune to death-based magic and abilities. Within the stones that he'd been shifting through after the creature's death, he found a moonstone. It was a faintly magical, natural crystal. It hadn't been enchanted previously. He'd never seen anything of the sort. Definitely keeping it for future experimentations. Now, considering the last two doors that had been trapped, Victor was a bit nervous with this. It helped that the wooden doors appeared to be sealed with something as well. His fireballs and firebombs didn't work in this realm. He, therefore, would have to stick with a more brutal method. At least that appeared to work just fine. The bolt of lightning carved right through the wooden door. This root needed taking care of, though. He didn't need them attacking him. To his right was a corpse overgrown with roots. Quite old by the looks of it. Some poor soul. The useful scroll of divine power was on him, though. Especially considering where he was, something that could remove poisons was most assuredly welcome. Now what else? Certainly that couldn't have been all that was in this chamber. And the door to his right, but since they were all reinforced, he felt safe exploring further first. He didn't particularly savor the idea of just moving on without knowing what was behind him. More blood dripped from the ceiling. Were the rats using these markers as places to eat? Would he be attacked again here? It didn't seem so. It was just more blood dripping from the ceiling. Taking a moment to be very careful in his examination of his surroundings. And still seeing nothing. It seemed that either he was truly blind, or it was just a side chamber. He'd expected more, honestly, though he wasn't opposed. Another door. Taking a step back. Walking forward, Victor would, after destroying the door, would examine what was within and not like what he saw. Pitch black energy, a bridge of some sort, what appeared to be rippling roots of shadow, and a shadow var. Although the man was far more skilled than the others he dealt with thus far, luckily he'd seemed unarmed. If the man had a magic weapon, he might be in for a much worse experience. Luckily, it seemed even though he was outclassed in physical combat, he was still going to be the victor. Well, unintentional puns. Perhaps the little fairy dragon had worn off on him. No, this inky darkness made him uneasy, but at least it seemed to be non-threatening. Now here there's a kid in some rags. Piles of books. Broken weaponry. This explained why the man was unarmed, he supposed. What about the bookshelves? All of them were far too gone for him to be able to read them, unfortunately. And since he could clearly see a trap, Victor decided to take the most direct approach once again. With it completely destroyed, hopefully whatever remained within was still whole. And it most assuredly was. The Shadowvar were worshippers of the mask. I suppose that made sense. It was not something that he himself could use, but it was quite the potent enchantment. Some jewelry, a scroll, a poison of some sort. Interesting. An ornament. Very nice ornament at that. And a shovel. Of the abyss. Perhaps it could be used to remove the tree ant. When some nature spirits were killed, they were reduced not to death, but instead to a basic seed or their base form. It might be possible that Victor could save the nature spirits that had been tortured and tormented by this plane, assuming he made it back to the natural plane of the material, at least. The bite of those tendrils hurt, but thankfully his regeneration, granted to him by the enchantments, handled it well enough. Constant hiss of snakes and probably undead, combined with the sounds of the rats, was still a bit daunting. And now, unfortunately, Victor was at a bit of an impasse here. He needed to break down that door, but the beetles would be hit by the bolt as well, and he couldn't get them to move. They'd done him no harm, but they were also just animals in the end. He didn't really wish to kill them, but if they were giving him no choice, then so be it. He'd do his best not to hit them with it. And he managed it, hitting above them instead. Now he just had to find his way through them. Easier said than done. It seemed the creatures had beat their heads so hard into the door that they would stun themselves, possibly, or perhaps even cause permanent damage. Well, this was unfortunate, but he didn't really see another option. If they intended to run, he wouldn't stop them. It seemed they didn't wish to attack him, as long as they stayed out of his way. It seems the shock had woken them up. Well, he'd still had to kill one of them, but that was better than the whole herd. He'd hate to disrupt the natural ecosystem of this plane. What little of it there was. Another of these damned doors. He'd used the last of his memorized lightning bolts. Perhaps a ray of negative energy, but it would just bounce right off that magical carapace that covered the door. Milf's acid arrow likely wouldn't hold the raw power it needed. Perhaps he'd have to just brute force it, as it were. If he even could. Thankfully, it seemed the toxin was based on poison, not disease. He'd be able to burst right through it without issue. He had no reason to fear poison abilities. His amulet rendered him immune to such things. Slush bug. He wasn't certain what to make of that, but the toxic gas that surrounded them was not something he was exactly eager to jump into. Perhaps it was time to actually switch back to his crossbow for once. Just like with the basilisks. Though they may not give him much of a chance. An occasional peppering from the bolt should eventually put them down. It was clearly doing damage to them, at least. Well, it seemed he was wary of that gas for good reason. It had killed that beetle. Well, it seemed that the creatures themselves were actually killing them as well. Don't let them corner you, Victor. At least they didn't seem to regenerate. Victor felt like he was having more physical combat practice on this plane than he was anything else. Though perhaps that was for the best. 2 down now, just 1 left, and it was on its last legs. That was assuming he could hit it. Reholstering the crossbow and pulling his staff back from his back. They didn't appear to be too dangerous, but he had no intention of just jumping towards them. Oh, good. Right then. Death by a million paper cuts indeed. Hello everyone, and thank you for watching. If you'd like to see future content, be sure to subscribe and hit that bell notification icon. If you'd like access to bonus content, such as special privileges on my personal Discord, extra information on my stories and world building, or perhaps simply wish to support my work here, please consider becoming one of my patrons on Patreon. Thank you for all your time, and I can't wait to see you in the next chapter of our story.